I have a sew along for one of my new favourite dresses. It's the Vogue 9182, and the Patreon peeps voted for this version a couple of years ago now. I was always going to make the pattern, but they picked that particular fabric, and I'm really glad that they did, and I love how it's turned out. So much so that I wanted to make another one. This lemon print viscose linen blend that I got from Sew Me Sunshine, I think it was Sew Me Sunshine, seemed like the perfect choice for this pattern. It's all of my favourite things. A fitted bodice, a button-up dress, and a very full skirt. It even has pockets in it. One thing that I did want to do with this dress is raise up the back neckline. That was for a couple of reasons, one of which was that I was hoping this dress could be a layering piece, which is how I've styled the other version, and I do really like how that looks. The higher back means that I can wear some of my more voluminous shirts underneath of it, and I don't end up with a very puffy area in the back because of the higher neckline back there. Another reason is that for me, I find that sometimes very narrow straps like this with a low front and a low back can sometimes fall off my shoulders, which is not something that I want to worry about or stress about when I'm wearing a dress out and about for the day. So I really like how the higher back has come out, and it was a very easy alteration to make. It was definitely inspired by Emily Hallman. Unfortunately, I can't link to the blog post that she did about it because her blog is now private, but it was definitely an alteration that was inspired by her make, and also, as I say, the desire for a layering piece. Given the nature of this fabric, I don't think I will wear this one as a layered dress because this to me screams summer. I did get this finished in time for the So Fruity challenge, which is a June challenge, and I am filming this at the end of August, but I didn't photograph it to get up on Instagram in time for that, as you can definitely tell. So I think you can tell that I really like it. There's definitely going to be more than just the two of this dress. It takes around about 4.5 meters of fabric depending on the width of fabric that you have. I had 5 meters, and I've been able to get this dress and a small tie front shirt out of the randomly shaped offcuts that were left over. I love this dress. I think it's super comfortable, and there will definitely be more made. It's, in my opinion, ideal for this viscose linen type of fabric, and I have quite a few of those in the stash behind me. So yes, there definitely will be more than the two that I currently own. So if you want to see the alterations that I've made and how I put this particular dress together, let's get on to the sew along. We have a few things that we need to do to get ready to trace out the pattern. Tracing patterns is just my favourite because it allows me to alter the tracing in ways that I wouldn't be comfortable altering the tissue paper, but you don't have to trace, it's just my preference. So the first thing that I like to do is work out what size I'm going to be tracing, especially with a custom fit pattern like this one because it has the different cup sizes in it. So there is an entire section here about how to find your cup size. So you want to measure around the fullest part of your bust and then your upper bust, and the difference between those tells you what cup size that you should be going for. Mine ended up being a 3-inch difference, so it was cup size C, which is pattern pieces 3 and 7 for the front of the bodice. I like to write down all of my pattern piece numbers so that I can cross them off as I have traced them out, because that way I don't miss anything and I don't have to come back and unfold tissue paper. I've done that in the past. So the next thing that we need to do is work out what size I need to trace. Now, according to the details on the envelope, I need to be doing a size 18 for the bust for a 40-inch bust, a size 14 for a 28-inch waist, and a size 22 for 46-inch hips. My hips are actually fluctuating between 44 and 45. If I was going for something slightly more fitted, I probably would err on the size of caution and go for the bigger one, because you can always alter and make it fit you afterwards. Obviously, this dress has a very large circumference around the hip, so it's not really an issue. The sizes that you can see that I've gone for is a size 14 bust, 12 waist, and 12 hips. And like I say, I went for the 12 hips because it is such a full skirt that it just made it easier to go for the same size as the waist size that I had chosen, so that everything fit together nicely. I didn't have to try and grade between the two sizes. I've worked out the sizes that I want by looking at the pattern tissue paper. So as you guys probably are aware, I have made this dress ages ago, years ago. I've already done all of this, so I hadn't filmed it this time round. So I'm getting out just a little bit of the tissue paper so that I can show you guys how I altered the back. So technically I need pieces 9 and 10, but I also want to show you, oh, that's good, that's 3 and 7. So this is the piece with the front pattern pieces on. When you do this, please, 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 please iron your tissue with a dry, coolish iron to iron out all of these creases, because just even the smallest, tiniest of crease can alter the way that your lines look. It can alter the size, and if you start adding, you know, 1/8 of inches to pattern pieces by accident the whole way around, it can drastically alter the size. The finished garment measurements are on the front bodice piece, which we have here. For me it's number 3, but it could be piece 1, 2, 3 or 4 depending on the cup size that you've gone for. So we have the bust measurements here and then the waist measurements here. So the bust, I want a 40-inch bust, but I do like my clothes fairly tight fitting. That is a preference of mine, and this dress also has an overlap built in. So technically, as I mentioned, I should be going for the size 18. I've only got the size bundle that goes up to the size 14. The finished garment measurement for the 14 is 39.5 inches, which actually ended up working perfectly for me. So I've gone for the 14 for the bust. And then down here at the waist measurement, the size 12 is a finished garment measurement of 28.5 inches, which again works perfectly for me. So I know the kind of fit and ease that I like in my dresses. I like very tight fitting, close fitting bodices. So I tend to go for just over my measurements, and in fact this one is just under my bust measurement and just over my waist measurement, and it fits really, really well. If you haven't made a lot of Vogue patterns, McCall's patterns, Butterick patterns, which are the ones that I work with most often, their block fits me really, really well, so I can get away without having to make a wearable muslin or even a toile. But if this is your first time using a Vogue block and you aren't sure if it's going to work for your proportions, cut it out of an inexpensive fabric or calico or muslin first to test the fit of the bodice. And because I'm also doing an alteration to the back neckline, you may want to test the fit of that on yourself as well, because you may want it higher, lower, you might want to scooch things in so that it sits flat against your back. Everybody is different and every body is different, so I do highly recommend making a muslin, even if it is just the bodice. If you use a lining fabric and it fits, you can use that fabric and that toile that you've made up as the lining for your actual dress. So that's where you find the finished garment measurements. It's on the front bodice of the pattern, which is pieces 1, 2, 3 and 4 depending on the cup size that you've chosen. So I am going for a 14 for the bust and a 12 for the waist and the hips. So now that I've worked all of those things out, I need to go through and trace all of my pattern pieces. Now, as you guys know, I have already made this, so I can cross out these ones because I have already traced these all off. But I'm going to trace out the back pieces again for you so that I can show you the alterations that I made to the back neckline to raise it up and make it work for me. One other thing I will say is that there are skirt extension pieces because the tissue wasn't wide enough for the very full skirt that this dress has. If you can see here, we've got a solid line and then there's a dotted line. Hopefully you can see there's a dotted line all the way across. So when you trace this out, or if you cut this out, you're actually going to be overlapping the pieces and matching up the dotted lines and sticking it together so that the dotted lines match up the whole way along the two pieces. So 13A goes to the pattern piece 13. So basically what I'm trying to get at is that you're not matching up the solid line or matching up the dotted line. That is important. Although as long as you do the same for the front and the back, I guess it doesn't really matter. You'll just end up with a slightly longer skirt. Anyway, let's find the back pieces. So I have traced out all of my pieces and crossed them off of my list, which just to me means that I don't need to go back in and unfold everything, repress it and retrace it because I missed a piece out. It's just something that I've done in the past, so this works for me. Whatever works for you is also good. As you can see here, hopefully I have traced this out in blue so that you can hopefully see what I'm doing, and I'm going to try and do my alterations in a different colour. Something that I have done is give myself a lot of room above the top of the centre back bodice piece. I was worried that I hadn't given myself quite enough because I have traced the side back bodice up there, but it's okay, I have. So the very first thing that I did was just elongate the centre back seam. And it doesn't really matter how much, I just want to draw a straight line all the way up because I know that this is a straight line because it's cut on the fold, so it has to be a straight line, there's no shaping in there, so I just drew it all the way up. Then the next thing I did was try and work out how tall I wanted the back of my dress to be. So the original, as you can see here, is quite low, and this is what we've ended up with. on my pattern that I've made up. So that's the top of it. So I will give you a measurement. Now you can see I started off with it being a little bit lower than that, but I ended up going for an additional 6 inches on top of the center back seam, and that was because, as I mentioned in the intro, I wanted to be able to layer this piece, and I don't overly like wearing shirts because it can end up a little bit puffy in this area. Also, very narrow straps do tend to fall off of my shoulders. So now that I have elongated this bit, I need to elongate this seam here. This is also fairly straight. So again, I just drew straight up from there. So yeah, I just drew literally straight up from there. This was all a guess. I have no idea if this is the correct way to do this. I was definitely inspired by Emily Hallman's blog, but it's no longer available. So I kind of just guessed what I was doing. So this side I have added from the original ending point up to where I finished it off is 4 7/8 of an inch. Like I say, it was a guess. It was just like a fluff around and find out kind of a deal. So the next thing that I did was measure how wide this piece was, and it is an inch. On mine, I've actually gone for 1.25 inches, and it is fairly straight across. And then this line here is at a right angle. That is 3 inches over, and I'm putting my 1 inch line on the centre back seam and gone 3 inches over, so obviously there's an inch this side, and I'm doing that so I'm squaring it up. So I've gone to the 4 inch mark and drawn a line, and then I basically just rounded that out. So those are the measurements. So this is 6 inches above. This was 4 7/8 up there. This was 1.25 inches long. This was 3 inches long, and then just round that corner out. And that is basically how I've ended up with the pattern piece that I have. And it's worked, as you've seen. It was all trial and error. It was give it a go, fluff around and find out. And yeah, it worked. So the next thing that we need to do is alter our side back piece. Now, if you look at the original pattern here, hopefully you can see there is a teeny tiny jog in the pattern there, and that is for the way that the seam allowance is allowed for and joined together to form the straps. Obviously we are not going to be finishing up the back neckline at this part because we've just raised it up by 6 inches. So what I did with my original pattern piece is I smoothed that out, and that was the only change that I made to the back pattern piece. I just probably used my French curve. I literally kind of just smoothed that out, and I cut without that jog in there, because again, in my head, that jog is there for the strap to be sewn to the centre back panel. That worked. I've ended up with pattern pieces that look like this, and so I walked my seams and worked out where my seam was going to be getting joined to. Something that you can do if you're finding that the back neckline is gaping a little bit for you, you can always cheat this in a little bit. So you can always just shave off a tiny amount that side. So that is a curved seam. I mean, it's a really, really subtly curved seam, but if you're finding that this is gaping away from your back, you don't like how that looks, and this is why you should always make muslin, again, at least out of your lining fabric, because this is a really easy thing to tweak on the final fabric. It's not something that's you fundamentally can't change once you've cut the fabrics out. If you're finding that this is gaping, you can just curve this seam in, and if you curve it in more than, say, like 1/8 of an inch here, add whatever you curve in to this part to kind of make up for that. But that curved in seam, when you sew it to the other one, will bring those together and help it sit flush to your back. That's basically how I added length to the back of this pattern. And like I say, I cut it out, I tried it, I loved how it looked. This was definitely a fluff around and find out, and it worked. I genuinely don't know if this is the correct way of doing this or not, as I say, but as you will see in the rest of the sew along, it all goes together really well and I love the end result. So this is what I did. The other thing that I did to my pattern pieces, which I always have to do to my pattern pieces, is I added an inch of length to the torso, and I did that for the 2 back pieces and the 2 front pieces. And there are lengthen and shorten lines on the pattern, which I have traced out here. They're the double lengthen and shorten lines here and here. There is a video about how to add length or take length away from pattern pieces, which I will link up there for you. But yes, very, very simple, easy and effective modification to the back of this dress. So now that we have altered our pattern, let's get our fabric cut out. As you can see, the skirt panels for this pattern are huge, which meant that I couldn't fold the fabric selvage to selvage because the skirt panel wouldn't fit on. So I have a double layer of fabric here, and the only reason that works is because this is a non-directional print. I've lined everything up and I'm starting to place my pattern pieces on the fabric from the cut ends working towards the fold, and I have 5 meters of this fabric, so this length is doubled over and 2.5 meters roughly. I always work from largest pattern pieces downwards, so I have placed on one of my skirt panels, and once I have the grain line lined up with the edge of the fabric, I start pinning that into place. So technically the next biggest pattern piece is the other skirt panels, but obviously it won't fit onto the fabric you can see here. So the next piece that I placed is the skirt facing, because that is quite long. Then I start adding in all the bodice pieces that don't need to be cut on the fold and the pocket pieces. Obviously I need 2 sets of pockets, so 4 pieces in total. So once everything was cut out, I used this spare scrap of fabric to cut out the remaining 2 pocket pieces. Once all of these pieces have been cut out, I readjust the fabric and do exactly the same thing. Largest pattern piece first, and then fitting everything else in around it on the small pieces of fabric that are left over. I always knew I wanted to make this pattern. Back in July of 2020, I put up a couple of different fabric options for the Patreon peeps to pick from, and they chose this one. I absolutely loved how this turned out, and I love the actual dress as well, which is why I've gone on to use this very precious lemon print fabric to make up this second iteration. There will definitely be more. So thank you very much to the Patreon peeps for voting for this particular fabric. As you can see, there is a whole list of Patreon peep names of scrolling down the screen. I also have some new Patreon peeps to welcome to the channel. So thank you very much for joining, and welcome to Rosemary Kimemia, Linda Best, Segalan, Sandra Floriandra, Deirdre Brown, Beth Jarvis, Melissa, Cynthia Jackson, Serena Kay, Pilar Paradello, Annie Moray, Christiane, Barbara Eckenfals, Denise Vitale, Vanessa, Sigrid, Nurse Anita, Monica Goulet, Faye Warren, Kristen, Tom, Joanna O'Dowd, Rebecca Schultz, Flamingo Tango, Miss Christielle N, Lynn French, the Dowager Duchess Isabel Thompson, and last but not least, the very lovely Chloe. I also need to say thank you to Thomas Norvale for a very lovely coffee. Thank you very much to everybody for joining Patreon, and thank you to everybody that has been a member of Patreon for as long as you have been. You really do make a giant difference to the channel. Thank you. I ended up with just under 1 meter of fabric left, which I squirreled away to the side because the offcuts from the skirt pieces were big enough for the centre back panel and the remaining bodice piece. I obviously only needed one of the 2 layers that I had left over from cutting out that final skirt piece, and whenever possible, I love to make a matching scrunchie to go with my dress. The pattern for this is from Threads Monthly, and it's linked in the description down below. As ever, I am starting out of order with step number 11, which is to stitch the skirt back together along the centre back seam, which is the one with the triple notches on it. I'm going to do that with a French seam. I am using a viscose linen, which is slightly thicker than other fabrics that I use for French seams, but I do think that it's going to look nice with French seams and it's going to work well. So I need to stitch the centre back seam, which is this one here. You can see the triple notches there. I'm going to stitch it together at 1/4 of an inch with the wrong sides together to get the French seam started. As you guys know, I like to do as many steps at the sewing machine as I can before I have to get up and go to the ironing board. So I have sewn my first line of stitching at 1/4 of an inch, and I'm now going to start French seaming my inseam pockets into the skirt pieces. There is a full tutorial up here for French seaming an inseam pocket, but in case you don't want to go somewhere different, or if you just want to follow along with me currently, you can do. But if you do want to do this technique in the future, you won't need to scrub through the entirety of this video to get to this section. There is a standalone dedicated video for it. I have my pocket pieces here. I have cut out 2 pairs. What we need to do now is take one of those pairs, and with wrong sides together, we're going to place our pockets onto our skirt back. Now there is a notch, so we want to match that up, and the wrong sides together is the important part here, so I'm going to pin that into place. So I'm going to do the same for both sides of the back and both the side seams of the front with the remaining pocket pieces. Once they're all pinned into place, I'm going to sew and backstitch at the top, and then sew right down to the end of the pocket bag and backstitch there at 1/4 inch. It's very important to make sure that you don't carry that stitching over onto the actual skirt panel. You want to keep it onto the pocket bag only. So I'm going to get that done for all 4 pocket bags on the side seams of both back panels and both front panels. And you want to make sure that you are sewing it to the side seam. There's the double notch of my side seam there, and then there is also a notch to match up with the pocket notches on the pocket bag piece as well. So 1/4 inch backstitch at the top and the bottom, and do that for all 4 pieces. This is one of the front panels with its beginning French seamed inseam pocket sewn on. I have sewn it 1/4 inch, and then I've trimmed off the excess. Now hopefully, if I can get it to focus, you'll be able to see that there's a little cut out in the seam allowance. So the seam allowance of the skirt panel is still intact, but I have trimmed down the seam allowance of the pocket bag to just under 1/8 inch. So I'm now going to take this over. I've done the same for all pocket bags, and I've trimmed the centre back seam as well, because as I say, I like to do as many of the same processes as I can before I have to get up and do something different. But I do need to go to the ironing board now. So I'm going to press this flat like this just to set the seam. Then I'm going to fold the pocket bag back and press all the seam allowance into the pocket bag, and I'm going to do the same for all 4 pocket bags. Then once that seam's pressed flat and over like that, I'm then going to roll the seam allowance so that I can press it so that it'll end up with the right sides together, and I'll end up with a nice crisp edge here that I can then sew down to finish the French seam. So I'm going to do that for all 4 pocket bags. I'm also going to do it for the centre back seam so I can finish that French seam as well. I have pressed everything, and I have just sewn the pocket bags at another 1/4 inch, which is meaning that they will be inset into the skirt seam once the side seam has been sewn, because usually the seam allowance on this pattern is 5/8 inch, so 2/4 inch obviously only equals 1/2 inch. I am now going to take this over to the ironing board, and I'm going to press all of the seam allowance into the pocket bag. I've also sewn the centre back seam, but that one I did do at 3/8 inch like a regular French seam, because that one doesn't need to have anything inset into it. That one I'm just going to press over to the left. It doesn't matter left or right, whichever is your preference. So I'm going to go get everything pressed so that we can then sew the skirt fronts to the skirt backs. I've sewn my skirt fronts to my skirt backs around the pocket and down to the hem at the side seam with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now I need to trim that down to 1/8 inch or just under. I do need to be really careful around this corner here. You want to trim away as much of this excess as you can, but you need to be very careful not to clip into and through your stitching line. Ask me how I know. It really helps if you have scissors that are sharp to the point. If you don't, go carefully, cut away a little bit, and then cut away a bit more once you're happy with it. You can always cut away more, you can't add, as you all know. So I'm going to get both of these trimmed, and then I'm going to go and press them with the right sides together so I can finish off the French seams. I've pressed everything flat, and then I have French seamed the pocket bag all the way down to the skirt hem, pivoting at the corner. You hopefully can just about see that I have gone over the previous line of French seaming by a couple of stitches, just to ensure that the pocket bag is set into the side seam rather than right on it. Then I have gone and put in another line of stitching from the pivot point here up to 1 inch above that, and I've backstitched at the beginning and the end, and then from the waist down, I've put in a line of stitching 2 inches down, and again it's back stitched at the beginning and the end, and that's 3/8 of an inch away from the folded edge of the original French seam. So I'm now going to go and press everything towards the front. We want all these seams pressed towards the front because we're going to need to baste our pocket bag to the waist seam of our skirt pieces, which means that the seam allowances are all going to want to sit towards the front. So I'm going to go and get that done for both sides. Pressed the seam allowances towards the front. The pockets are nicely inset, and I have basted the top of the pocket towards the front along the waistline. So the next thing that we need to do is work on the facing pieces for the skirt, which is number 15. Finish unnotched edges of skirt front facings. Pin skirt front facing to skirt front, matching raw edges, stitch, trim, understitch facing. So we have cut out the interfacing for our front facings. We want to finish off the unnotched edge. So there is a notch here, and that means that that's where it's going to be sewn to the center front seam of the skirt, and the top of the facing kind of curves up like that, and it's the top of the curved edge that we want to finish. Now, as you can see, I started mine with bias binding. There's a couple of different ways you could finish this. I have a video about facing your facings up here. I also have another video which will be linked down below on sewing in bias binding if you've never done it before. It's a very simple process. I have taken the right side of my bias binding and I've put it against the wrong side of my facing, and I have stitched in the ditch, which is 1/4 of an inch. So I'm now going to go and press that so that it is nice and flat, so all the seam allowance is into the bias binding, and once it's pressed it'll lie a lot flatter than it is now. I'll be able to roll the binding over like that and then top stitch that edge down. I'm going to do it with my edge stitch foot as close to the folded edge as I can from the top to the bottom, and I'll do that for both pieces. And the important thing to note here, as we mentioned, it's the unnotched edge. So there's the notch which goes to the center front seam, and if you want more confirmation, it is the top of the curved part. So this is the top, and there is a notch on the edge that you don't want to finish. So I'm going to get this bias binding finished for both pieces, and then we can attach it to the skirt. I've got nicely finished edges on my facings, so I'm going to take my skirt, which is an awful lot of fabric at this point, and I am going to match up the notched edge with the little notch that's in the skirt center front seam or edge. Pin that into place and then pin the rest of this from top to bottom, and I'm going to sew that at 5/8 of an inch, and I'm going to do the same for both sides, and it's right sides together. One thing that I will just add is the reason I do the skirts first, especially when they're circle skirts like this, is because I want to hang them up and give them time to drop on the bias. So I'm not actually going to sew my facing all the way down to the bottom edge. I'm going to leave myself a good sort of 2 inches flapping free, which means that when I come to level the skirt, which I'll do in about a week's time, I have free access to all of the skirt hem. That's when I can level it, attach bias binding to finish it off, and I'll show you. For you it will be a couple of steps, for me it will be like I say, about a week's time. I'll show you how I finish this edge neatly to get a nice crisp corner on the bottom of my skirt. So if you're following along with me, you want to sew all the way from the top, backstitch at the very top of the waist seam for your facing, but leave a good sort of 2 inches free at the bottom. And we'll do the same for the understitching. We'll stop the understitching a good 2 inches away from where we've stopped stitching, so I'll show you that when we get there. I've sewn my facing onto my skirt panels, and then I've pushed all the seam allowance over to the facing, and I have understitched. We've got a line of understitching about 1/8 of an inch away from the crease of the seam that puts the facing and the skirt together. Now personally, I don't like to press before I do my understitching. Something you could do is you could press it flat like this and press all the seam allowance over and then understitch, but I find that I get a better result if I don't press first and put the understitching in, because the understitching then helps everything roll to where I want it to be pressed, which is basically making sure that the facing is fully on the inside of the skirt. I find that if I press it open like this and then press it closed and then understitch, you've already put in like a crease where the fold's going to be, as it were, and this way you get the understitching helps you to have this pressed into place exactly where you want it, which is with a 1/16 of an inch of the skirt front showing on the facing side of things. So I'm going to go and give this a press now. I will just say that I have left my 2 inches unattached at the bottom, and then I started my understitching 2 inches up from that, so this area isn't understitched, and that's just so that when I come to this later I'm going to be easily able to get back at the beginning or the end of the seam that I stitched in previously. You can see here, if I'd have understitched right to where I'd stitched before, you can't access the previous line of stitching. So I'm going to go get this pressed, and I'm going to hang the skirt up to let its bias do its thing. We can start working on the bodice. I've just fused my interfacing to my centre front pieces. I am now going to move on to step number 2, which is stay stitch the side edges of each bodice front. So that is this kind of curved edge, which has got the double notches that get sewn to the princess seam of the side fronts. I'm going to get that done for both of these. I like to stay stitch at 3/8 of an inch, and stay stitching just allows you to clip into but not through the stay stitching to make this seam fit into the curved princess seam slightly better. We're going to need to do this for both the outer and our lining pieces. You don't have to do them all at the same time, especially if you have a very different coloured lining to your outer, but if you don't mind either changing thread or having the same colour thread on your lining as you have on your outer, personally I would do it all in one go. What happens with patterns like this is they'll get you to do all of the outer pieces of the bodice, and then there'll be a line in here saying prepare and stitch bodice lining sections together in same manner as bodice. So you might as well do all the steps at once rather than repeat everything in 2 separate sections, if that makes sense. So stay stitching 3/8 of an inch the entire length of this curved line. This is the centre front of our bodice, and this is the seam that gets sewn to the princess seam. So I'm going to do that for all 4 pattern pieces. So I've done my stay stitching and I have pinned my bodice front to my bodice side front. I've matched up the notches and I pinned from the bottom and the top of this piece, and then I've pinned around this curve. I like to sew with that underneath my presser foot and then this piece on top of the feed dogs. I find that it's easier to make sure that I don't end up with any tucks or puckers in this seam that way. Sometimes people like to sew the other way around so that the feed dogs deal with the excess, and that's, if that's your preference, it's a really good way of sewing it as well. But like I say, for me, I prefer to be able to see this fullness here to make sure that I am not sewing in any tucks to this seam. So I've done this for both of the outer pieces and both of the lining pieces, and I'm going to sew at 5/8 of an inch from the bottom right to the top. You might think that this looks slightly wrong up at the top here. There is a tiny little notch here on the pattern piece, which is what matches up with the top of the front bodice piece. So this piece here, you're going to be sewing at 5/8 of an inch to this little corner here of the flat piece of the bodice front. And that is correct, because this piece here will then get sewn into the lining, which will create the neckline for the bodice. So I'm going to get all 4 pieces sewn at 5/8 of an inch, and then we can move on to the back, because I do differ slightly from the pattern in my construction of this bodice. So 5/8 of an inch top to bottom back stitching at the beginning and the end. I've sewn my seams and I've clipped my curves. I'm going to go and press these seams open, and then we can move on to sewing the bodice backs together. In fact, I'm actually going to do that now, because as I mentioned, I like to do as many things as I possibly can before I have to get up and go to the ironing board. So I'm going to do the same thing. We need to pin the bodice back sides to the bodice centre back, and as you know, I've raised up the back neckline on mine quite significantly, but it does so in exactly the same way as the pattern would suggest. There's my bodice back with right sides together. I am going to match up the notches. There is one singular knot. stitch. So I'm going to get this all pinned together and then I will show you where I am sewing to and from. I've got the centre back on top here and I've got the side backs underneath. I'm going to sew from the bottom of the centre back up to the place where the strap joins the centre back piece here, and I'm going to back stitch here and I'm going to sew at 5/8 of an inch, and I'm going to do the same for the outer and for the lining. According to the pattern, it would like us to stitch bodice front to bodice back at the side seams. I don't want to finish my bodice the way that this pattern would like me to, so I'm actually going to deviate from here on out. So the next thing that I'm going to do is take my bodice back and my bodice fronts, and I am going to stitch together the shoulder seams. So you want to make sure that you're getting your centre front in the centre front and not using these as side seams. You'll be able to tell which is the centre front pieces because they're the interfaced ones. So I'm going to pin my shoulder seams together and sew those at 5/8 of an inch, and I'm going to do the same for the lining as well as the outer bodice. Then I will go and give everything a press, and I'm going to press all of my seam allowances open. I have pressed all of my seams open, but when you pin this together, and we are pinning the neckline and front edge together with the right sides together, so here is the center front edge, this is the waist, and then we're going around the corner, you'll find that you need to bring the seam allowance into the center on the princess seam, and the same for the back seam. Now I have pressed these open and I've pinned them, as I say, towards the centre front and towards the centre back. I'm going to sew them all the way around at 5/8 of an inch and understitch, and then I'm going to clip into the seam allowances to release them so that they can still lie flat. So I'm going to sew this at 5/8 of an inch from the waist seam, pivot up at this top edge all the way around the neckline and down to the opposite waist seam. Once I have got that 5/8 of an inch seam allowance in place, I'm going to clip curves, release the seam allowances so that they can continue to sit flat, and then I can understitch the entire neckline to make sure that everything lies nice and flatly. But to begin with, you do need to pin and sew all of the seam allowances towards the centre front and the seam allowances towards the centre back. I've sewn all around the perimeter of the dress, or the neckline of the dress. The next step is going to be to clip my corners, or chop off my corners, clip into the curves, release the seam allowances where I have sewn them all the way over, just basically trim everything off so that it's all ready to be understitched. So that's what I'm going to do, go around, trim off all the excess and clip into all the curves. I have trimmed off all of my excess seam allowance. I have braided around the corners and I have clipped into the curves around the beginning and the end of the straps front and back. I've also clipped in to release as much of the fabric as I can so that I can go back and press everything open again, even though I have sewn this part closed. So the next thing I'm going to do is push everything around to the front and push all the seam allowance into the lining side of things, and I'm going to understitch the lining. Now with corners you'll be able to get close, but you won't be able to get right up to the corner, so I'll probably be finishing my understitching about an inch away from the corner and starting an inch away from that corner. I'm going to do the same up the centre front and all the way around the neckline. As you can see, I wasn't able to get my top stitching right the way into the corner, but that was as expected. So I've top stitched down the centre front and then all the way around the neckline. As I mentioned earlier, I prefer to top stitch with all of the seam allowance obviously into the lining and then just pulling the fabric apart. Once I have top stitched, I will then go and iron, and I'm really pleased with how this has turned out. So the next thing that we need to do is finish off the armholes. Now it is possible it's just going to be a little bit tight because these are quite narrow straps. So what we want to do is basically burrito everything into one strap. I am going to match up my shoulder seams, and I actually want to pin it with the fashion fabric out because I want to just overlap the lining by 1/8 of an inch, because we're not going to be able to top stitch, well, I mean technically you can top stitch, or sorry, understitch this part of the seam once it's sewn, but again you won't be able to get all the way into the shoulder seam because there just won't be room. So for me, rather than try and attempt that, I just offset the lining. I'm going to push the lining an 1/8 of an inch out and pin everything into place, and I'll show you what that looks like once I've done it all. The important part with this is to make sure that you are not catching anything except the 2 layers of fabric that you want to sew. So I'll get everything pinned and show you what I mean about the lining. Hopefully you can see here that the lining is offset an 1/8 of an inch over the fashion fabric, and when we turn everything round, that will just mean that the lining will want to sit on the inside of the garment rather than right on the edge or roll out. So I'm going to sew from underarm to underarm at 5/8 of an inch the whole way around, and then I will trim this all with my pinking shears quite close to the stitching line to make sure that this all sits nicely once it has been turned through. The thing that you need to be careful about at this stage is to make sure that you don't catch any of the bodice or the other strap whilst you are sewing this. Once you have stitched, double check that you haven't caught anything before you start cutting into it, because once you've cut into it, there's no going back. So I'm going to sew this at 5/8 of an inch from underarm seam round to underarm seam. I have sewn from underarm seam to underarm seam all the way around. I've trimmed off all, well, I checked first, double checked first to make sure that there was nothing caught in the seam that I didn't want it to be, and then I trimmed off all the excess with my pinking shears, which has basically notched all of the edges for me. So now I can reach through, and this works with the fabrics that I've chosen because they are fairly and relatively flimsy and supple. If you're using a really stiff fabric for this pattern, this method won't work because, as you can see, the area that you're turning this through is quite small. So that is something to consider. So I'm very gently just working my bodice through, just gently pulling to turn everything through. It'll need a really good press, but I've got one nicely finished strap, and personally I find this method a lot easier than the method that is suggested by the pattern. As I mentioned, because we have sewn the lining slightly offset, it should want to roll to the inside when we press it, and you will want to press it with the lining side up to encourage that roll. So I'm going to do exactly the same thing for the other side, and it is the basic burrito method, which I have got a video on the channel up here if you want to have a look at that by itself in the future. So basically what I've got here is I've got my bodice laying down flat, and I'm going to roll this side up just to try and contain everything. And once we get to kind of that point, you take the lining and the main fabric and lay those down so that they are wrong sides down on the table. You've got the entirety of the rest of the bodice on top. Then you match up your shoulder seams. And again, I want to pin with my fashion fabric on top. So now that I've got that pinched, turn everything around and pin the entirety of the underarm seam together, offsetting the lining by an 1/8 of an inch and making sure that you're not catching any of the bodice in that pinning as you go. And once you've got that done, you're sewing from underarm seam to underarm seam at 5/8 of an inch. I have obviously repeated everything on the other side, and I have gone and pressed everything. So hopefully you can see just a little bit of the fashion fabric on both sides of the straps. That's so that the lining doesn't kind of like roll out to the outside, which is even more important than usual because I have used such a contrasting lining to the outer fabric. I didn't have anything in this blue colorway, so I've used this old remarkably soft Egyptian cotton sheet. It's going to be fabulous. I'm really looking forward to wearing this one. All we've got left to do now is finish up the side seams. I'm going to take one underarm seam, take the other underarm seam, and I'm going to match those up and then match the linings together, matching up the notches, and match the fashion fabric up together. And I'm going to sew from the waist seam to the waist seam at 5/8 of an inch the whole way down. I'm going to do the same for both sides. I'm going to press the seam open, and then I will press the underarm seam flat. You can and probably do want to try and nest your underarm seams, so have one set of seam allowance going one way, another set of seam allowance going the other way. That will just help everything lie nice and flatly when you turn it over. So I'm going to pin that all into place and sew from the waist waist seam to the waist seam at 5/8 of an inch, and I'm going to do the same for both sides. Once you've pressed everything, you should end up with a finished bodice that looks like this. Personally, as I say, I think this is an easier way of finishing off all of the pieces cleanly and nicely, and I'm really happy with the finish that I've got. But the method that the pattern does outline works as well. It's just a little bit more fiddly in my opinion. Now that we've got a finished bodice and a finished skirt, we need to move on to step 18, which is pin skirt to bodice, matching centers and seams, stitch keeping lining free, press seam forward, bodice. Not sure what that last sentence means. Let's get this done. I've pinned my skirt to my bodice, keeping the lining of the bodice out of the way. Been really careful to match up the edge of the skirt with the edge of the bodice, because if you get that even a little bit off, you can end up with a little weird jog in between the two. I've also kept the facing of the skirt pinned into place as well, making sure that everything is lying nice and flatly. When I sew this, I'm going to sew at 5/8 of an inch from the bodice stitching line, not the understitching line. For my understitching, I use a slightly longer stitch, so it's really easy to differentiate between the two, but it's the line of stitching that's closest to the bodice that we are going to stitch from. 5/8 of an inch all the way around from front edge to front edge, keeping the lining out of the way. I have sewn my skirt to my bodice. I'm now going to take it all over to the ironing board and press all of the seam allowance up towards the bodice, and then I'm going to press under the raw edge of the bodice lining by 5/8 of an inch so that I will be able to slip stitch it into place to enclose all of the raw edges. So press the seam allowance up into the bodice and press the bodice lining under by 5/8 of an inch. There are lots of different ways to level the hem of a bias cut skirt dress like this one. I really like the method that I'm demonstrating here, where I lay it flat on the table, smooth the fabric down, measure from the waist to my desired length, make a mark, and then cut off the excess that has dropped on the bias, which will inevitably happen with a fabric like this. There are, as I mentioned, loads of different ways of leveling a hem. I have an entire video on a few different methods, and I will link it in the description if you'd like to check that out. This one works really well for me, and I find the easiest to do, so it is my preferred method. But you do want to level the hem of your dress at this point so that we can finish off the hem to then finish off the dress. I have leveled the hem and I am now going to finish it off with bias binding. So for this method, I am going to take the right side of the binding, which is the side with no raw edges, and I'm going to put it against the right side of the fabric. I'm going to open out one of the folds and match up the raw edges, and I'm going to sew all the way around the perimeter of the hem in the fold, which will give me a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance or hem allowance that I can then press over and turn up. So right side of binding to right side of fabric and sewing in the ditch of the binding the whole way around. I have sewn the bias binding on the whole way around, and then I have flipped the edge over so that the entirety of the binding is on the inside, and there is a small tiny amount of the outer fabric showing. So now that that's done, I can finish off the facing edge. So what I want to do is, with right sides together, line everything up and pin it into place. This is one of those times that you really don't want everything to be floating in midair. You really want it all to be lying nice and flatly. So there we go. Okay, so you can see that I finished my stitching here, leaving those couple of inches free so that we could put the bias binding in. What I'm going to do now is backstitch at this point here and stitch all the way down to the line of stitching that's securing the bias binding to the hem, and then I'm going to pivot at the corner and stitch all the way along to the end of the facing and backstitch there, and I'm going to stitch as close to the stitching that secures the bias binding onto the skirt as possible. So I'm going to backstitch at the end of the line of stitching that we did earlier, pivot at the corner, and then backstitch when I get to the edge of the facing, which you'll be able to feel if you can't see it. If you're worried about that, you can make a little mark just to make sure that you don't go any further, because you don't need to go any further. So I'm going to do that right angle, and I'm going to do the same for the other side, and then we can trim off some excess to turn everything through and get a nice point. I have sewn the facing to the hem, and now I need to trim off all the bulk from this corner. That's going to include some of the bias binding that we've just sewn on. So trim that off, trim these pieces. This is just so that we can get a nice pointy corner. So everything's trimmed down. I'm going to grab my purple thing, push this through, and start gently working on the corner. This fabric is quite a loose weave, so I really don't want to make a giant hole with my pokey thing, but it's a little bit round still. You can always turn it back through and trim a bit more off if you would like, but that is a finished corner. So I'm going to give that a press, and then I will see how the pressing goes, but I think I'm actually just going to leave my understitching here. It's done what I need it to do at the top of the bodice, but I don't think it's going to make much of a difference for this last piece here. Now that I've done that for this corner, I'm going to do the same for the other corner, and then I can go round and slip stitch my bias binding into place to finish off the hem. I didn't show you the spacing of the buttonholes or putting the buttonholes into this dress for a number of reasons. It very much depends on the size of buttons that you go for. I actually ended up going for slightly larger buttons than the pattern recommends. Also, because I added length to the torso, I have had to change around the positioning of the buttons just so that they were evenly spaced, and I carried that spacing down onto the skirt portion. So it very much depends on the type of buttons that you want to use as to where you will space them. But I will say that the recommendation for the positioning of the buttonhole on the horizontal plane, I've done it exactly as the pattern recommended. It was just the spacing along the vertical that will change depending on the buttons that you want to use for your dress. I also didn't show you how I make buttonholes because my Bernina 830, it's a press one button and watch it go kind of a deal, and obviously everybody's sewing machine is different. So I will say, when you have worked out the size and density of the buttonhole that you want, practice on some scraps of fabric that have the same amount of layers and interfacing as your finished garment. Do a couple of test runs, make sure that the button actually fits through and that you're happy with the result, and start at the bottom buttonhole, because for some reason my machine had a little bit of a hissy fit and carried on going on one of the horizontal button bars, so that one's ended up being really long. I got very lucky. I used blue thread for the buttonholes and the longer part ended up in the blue part of the print, but if I had done that up here it would have been way more noticeable. So I always start at the bottom and work my way up, with the theory that your first one, it might be like a first pancake situation where you kind of want to throw the first one away, but unpicking buttonholes is never the easiest of things to do. I did try, but this fabric is such a loose weave that it wasn't a good time, and I just immediately switched gears and decided to leave it where it was and just live with the fact that it was at the bottom in a very full skirt and nobody's going to notice. So that's just my top tip for buttonholes, is start at the bottom, and by your last buttonhole, fingers crossed, you should be an expert, unless your machine gets fatigued and decides halfway through that it's had enough, which sometimes mine does as well. Buttonholes are always like one of those annoying things that you have to do at the end of a project and can make or break it. So yeah, start at the bottom and work your way up. I also didn't show you how I slip stitched the bias binding onto this one. I do have a video for that if you would like to see how I do it. It's a very lovely and easy technique for finishing a circle skirt like this. I also have a video on how to level your hems. I did talk you through how I did it on this one very quickly, but if you want to have a look at some of the different methods that I have tried and why I like this one, I do have a video about that up here as well. As I said at the beginning of the video, I love this dress. I will be making more. I think it's gorgeous. It's very comfortable to wear as well, because whilst it is fitted, it's not super tight. That is very pleasant in the warmer weather. Ask me how I know. So yes, very happy with this dress. And if you do decide to make your own and you put it up on Instagram or any of the social medias, don't forget to use the hashtag Sian Made Me Do It so that I can see exactly what you've made with this pattern. It's always so lovely to see what you guys get up to, and inspiration for different uses for different prints and fabrics as well. Hashtag Sian Made Me Do It if you do make your own version of this dress. If you have any questions at all, please let me know in the comment section down below. Fingers crossed I've covered everything, but sometimes I do miss stuff out, so just leave me a question down there and I will do my best to answer it for you. If you've enjoyed this video, you might want to check out this one here.